Thank you, Commodore Robbie Thomas, for that generous introduction. I am always very happy to meet BSF officers, for I have a soft corner for the BSF, having seen them in distant parts of our border regions and having seen the good work that they do over a long time. But I have also a fondness for the BSF because when I was in the National Security Council Secretariat for 4 years, one of my 4 or 5 directors happened to be a former DIG from the BSF, a highly decorated gentleman, DIG Shri J.S. Bhalla Sahab. And we got along so well that I, in fact, began to judge the force by the very high standards that Bhalla Sahab had set in the NSCS. So my regards to each one of you. And let me begin by saying that most recently, I have traveled to some of the distant corners of the country and been with the BSF at 2 ends of the country. I was in Doki earlier this year on the border with Bangladesh. And then very soon thereafter, I was in the Creek area for about 3 days. I was not in the Creek area for the first time. For about 10 years ago, when I was in the NSCS, I was in charge of coastal security. And then also I had traveled to the Creek area accompanied by Mr. Bhalla and made the necessary, prepared the groundwork for also the acquisition of the ATVs and the fast boats from Australia for induction into the Araminala beyond BP 1175. And I was very glad to see that as part of our recent study on modernization of the CAPF's Mod Plan 3, since I was chairing that study on behalf of the Ministry of Home Affairs, I had a chance to also compare the BSF with the other CAPFs and other forces, including the NSG, CRPF, ITBP, etc., Assam Rifles, the Seema Sashastra Bal, CISF. And I could see that the BSF again stood out for its very high standards. The ability to work in the most difficult of areas with the resources that are available, very high morale, and very good discipline. So my congratulations for that outstanding performance that you are all capable of. You see, the border security force needs no reminding that it is only on and within peaceful borders and a peaceful periphery that the nation can hope to prosper. So national security, national economic growth and development, infrastructure, progress of infrastructure, building programs in the border areas, all this depends on our ability to keep our border regions stable, peaceful and secure. And the BSF is playing a very important role in this regard. One of the greatest challenges that India faces today in the new and emerging world order is to ensure that our economic growth is rapid, so that it is a growth which matches the kind of growth that we have seen in the neighborhood in recent times. We have seen how China has emerged as one of the largest economies in the world today, second largest economy in a matter of roughly 40 years. In 1980, it might be important to mention that both India and China had a similar level of economic growth and per capita GDP. We started somewhat late after the Chinese did in terms of our opening up policy, and we did make relatively good progress as well. But today we do have to contend with these new geopolitical and geo-economic forces unleashed by the rise of China. The rise of China, which is manifested in its economic rise and also as a consequence in its military rise. More than that, it is a very assertive China today that is determined to make its presence felt not only in the region, but also across the world. So therefore, there is an inevitable clash of interests in Asia and in the oceanic spaces that bind India and China together. Today, the Chinese GDP is about 5 times, nearly 6 times that of India's, at a per capita GDP of 11,000 US dollars. It is moving ahead, rapidly moving into the middle income group. One does not know whether it will be a middle income trap for China, as it faces some intrinsic structural problems in its economy, and also has a lot of non-performing assets. After all, it is a state-led economy where everything is top down, even though the provincial economic centers are given a certain amount of freedom to compete and to take decisions on their own. But it is still what they call state capitalism. So that is a structural challenge they face. They also face the challenge of having a leadership that is so centralized in President Xi Jinping. And more than that, it is an aging population. But above all, China has also seen very poor relations with the United States of America in recent years. And we have to keep reminding ourselves, and hopefully the Chinese will also realize, that the United States of America is still the world's largest economy. At roughly $22 trillion, it is clearly ahead of China. Its per capita GDP is nearly 4 times that of China's. And it is a country that has a defense budget of nearly 650 to 700 billion US dollars. It is a country that has enormous capacity for R&D, cutting edge technologies, and the recent trade friction between China and the United States, which predates the pandemic, had already plunged the world into a certain kind of uncertainty. Under President Trump, relations had spiraled downwards, and there was an attempt at what they call decoupling also from the Chinese economy. Over the last 35 years, various countries of the world, including the United States, Europe, Asian countries, South Asian countries, ASEAN countries, African countries, had all acquired a certain dependence on China as global engines for economic growth shifted from the traditional space in the United States and the Western Hemisphere, in Europe, towards Asia. China was the preferred destination. And we have seen how China benefited in terms of the vast sums of investment coming in and the growth, which resulted in enormous trading opportunities also, enabling China to emerge as the world's largest trading nation as well. But these challenges that we have seen in recent years surfaced because of an intrinsic competition between China and the United States, for they represent very different ideologies. On the one hand, the United States of America is the reigning hegemon, as we might call it, has been so since the end of the Second World War, but largely represents what we call the free and democratic and open world. On the other hand, we have China, which is led by a communist party which believes in Marxism and socialism with Chinese characteristics. It is a centralized, monolithic, authoritarian system of governance. And yet, ironically, that system of governance, by astutely adjusting itself to the changing times, has also achieved a considerable amount of economic progress. And that has enabled China to also project to the rest of the world its own narrative as being a successful narrative. It has, unlike in the past, challenged the democratic narrative. It has, unlike in the past, challenged the narrative of a free and open society, of a free and open economy. In fact, it has given the example to many developing countries, especially in Asia and Africa, that their way of growth, their way of development, their way of governance is superior. And this came to a pass. This came to a test during the pandemic as well, because the pandemic created chaos everywhere. Pandemic left no country untouched, whether it was rich or poor, whether it was situated in the Western Hemisphere, whether it was situated in the Southern Hemisphere. It was, all equal in terms of the number of deaths that were being registered as a result of the COVID. So in this period during the pandemic also, this, division at the global level between the United States led democratic and open narrative and the Chinese led narrative for an authoritarian political and economic structure which delivers results. This got sharpened, this debate, this discourse, this difference of opinion. And we have seen that during the pandemic also attempts were made to decouple from the Chinese economy, because when the pandemic struck, it became very quickly apparent to the entire world that it is not just cars and automobiles and motorcycles and other things, manufactured goods that are all made in China today, but even PPEs and gloves and so many other items required to fight the pandemic, those supply chains were also centered in China, ironically. And the Chinese were able to game the system by sometimes raising prices, sometimes denying a country based on their political outlook towards China. If countries supported Taiwan, if countries supported the Quad, they are more likely than not to receive a rap on their knuckles, from China. And that got the global community also thinking about how to decouple from China. And as I said, this dialogue got sharpened during the pandemic. India too realized in the beginning that it had to depend on China, to bring in what you call ventilators and so many other things, oxygen concentrators. This decoupling, on the other hand, is easier said than done, because for 30 years, the world has relied on China. We have allowed our domestic capacities to deteriorate. We have allowed our industry to slowly die out. And this has actually been done by the private sector themselves, because they are chasing profits all the time. They want low cost goods to come in from outside as cheap as possible. And that has created a problem. But under the Atmanirbhar Bharat program, the government of India is trying to inject a kind of resilience in our outlook towards supply chains in general. But as I said, it's easier said than done. It is a difficult task for countries like India, but it is also a difficult task for the United States to completely cut off from the Chinese economy because of so much of economic interdependence. Japan too allocated roughly $2 billion for relocation of some of its industry back to Japan, and $200 million for relocation of their industry to certain other parts of the world. But of the 89 companies that left during a certain period, 57 of them relocated to Japan, and about 30 odd countries, relocated to Southeast Asia. Only 2 companies came to India, which is to emphasize the point that even though we have a special strategic and global partnership with Japan, a very key partner for India in the economic sphere, a very important member for India in the Quad, even Japanese companies chose to go to Southeast Asia rather than come to India. So that tells us that we have to create the right kind of policy framework and business opportunities for such companies which are decoupling from China to come and put up their factories and businesses in India. So broadly speaking, decoupling is something that can be done only gradually. Now, let me quickly tell you how the world is changing in many other ways, apart from these 2 points that I highlighted. One is the growing rivalry between a United States, which still remains the #1 power in the world, but which is not growing as fast as China. On the other hand, a China which has grown so fast, a China which has used existing global structures like the United Nations, its membership of the Security Council, its membership of very important groups such as the WHO, the UNDP, UNICEF, etc., to actually take on leadership roles at the global level, particularly at a time when under President Trump, the United States was recusing itself and moving away from active participation in the global structures. China, while propping up those structures which have allowed it to climb to the top, is also trying to tweak the international system to suit its requirements by setting up new structures, ones that are not led by Western countries. And a fine example of that, even at a multilateral level in the Asian context, would be, for instance, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, and at a bilateral level, it is promoting at the national level the Belt and Road Initiative with funding given by, easy funding given by its own banks in order to create its own narrative for multilateral cooperation. So here on this side, we see that many countries were being forced to take sides also during this period, before the pandemic, during the pandemic, whether the United States is the way to go, whether China is the way to go. And it also kind of created a difficult situation at the global level. The UN Security Council had stopped functioning for a while because of these differences between the permanent members. The US had pulled out of the WHO, the Paris Climate Change Agreement. It had stopped funding for certain UNICEF and other programs under Trump. And that gave China a chance to crawl in, creep in with its own ability to fund. China has become now the second largest contributor to UN funding, even more than Japan. And so obviously they are able to call the shots much more than in the past. So China is both a status quoist power in so far as its existing membership of the UN Security Council is concerned, but it is also an anti-status quoist power insofar as it challenges the reigning power, the United States of America, insofar as it challenges the interpretation of what is meant by rule of law, or what is meant by the international order. Because China says sometimes that the international order that was created by the West is not what China participated in, and China will not accept it. So China can be said to be hunting with the hounds and running with the hares also. It makes use of whatever has allowed it to rise, wants to keep that intact. On the other hand, it wants to tweak the global system more to suit its own future requirements. It is a good thing that under President Biden, the United States has once again stepped into multilateral organizations with renewed vigor by once again participating in a fulsome manner in the Paris climate change negotiations, the Paris Accord, of once again participating in WHO and UNICEF. The US has also once again, unlike Trump under Biden, the US is once again re-emphasizing its transatlantic partnership with the European countries, once again highlighting the importance of working together with NATO, whereas Trump was condemning NATO. Trump was trying to condemn even alliance partners in Europe as all being useless, etc. Unlike Trump, President Biden is once again highlighting the importance of the alliance partnerships in our part of the world with Japan, with Australia, with South Korea. And Trump, above all, has actually taken forward that legacy from, President Biden has taken forward the legacy of President Trump in reiterating that he too regards China as a competitor and as a rival. So the one thing he has in common with President Trump is the recognition that China is a strategic competitor, a strategic rival. The United States, he has said, will do its utmost to protect its interests. President Biden has reiterated that the United States will definitely maintain a presence in the Indo-Pacific. It is not going to go away, and that it will do so not in order to create conflict, but in order to prevent conflict. So that part of Biden's line with regard to recognition of the threat posed by China is consistent with what was seen during President Trump's period. But the nature of functioning, the manner in which President Biden is going about this task is different, because he is building alliances, not trying to erode them. He is fully aware that he has to work with other partners to create a constituency, to rival the kind of narrative and propaganda and influence peddling that the Chinese are quite successfully able to do, including through the use of soft power. So this is the scenario in which today India finds itself in the context of the Indo-Pacific, for example, where India has a very inclusive view of the Indo-Pacific. And I must tell you why the concept of the Indo-Pacific is important. You see, I mentioned to you earlier that the global economic engines shifted from the United States and Europe about 35, 40 years ago towards Asia. This happened after the rapprochement and improvement in relations between the United States and China in the 70s. And once that, rapprochement and improvement took place, and both were using each other to deal with a rising Soviet threat in those days, if you recall. After that, Japan also followed suit and began investing like the United States in China, beginning the late 1970s, when under Deng Xiaoping, China opened up and modernized its economy. The 4 modernizations, if you recall, the setting up of 14 special economic zones, the setting up of an umpteen number of scientific and technological parks and incubators. So during this period, we have seen that China was able to use this kind of investment to promote its economic growth. But we have also seen over time that China's economic growth has generally been kind of going in a parabolic curve, and now is beginning to slow down. I mentioned some structural issues, aging population, the decoupling war with US, etc. And at the same time, we have seen that growth and prosperity spread beyond China. It spread to other parts of Asia, to Southeast Asia. In the first period, we had seen how growth was also seen in Japan, in South Korea, in Taiwan, Hong Kong, in some parts of Southeast Asia. Even the Philippines was achieving rapid growth before the pandemic struck. But beyond that, beyond the so-called Asia, as it is recognized by the United States in previous literature, because earlier in previous literature, when America said Asia, they only meant China, Japan, and Korea. They didn't even know that Asia actually means India also. India was supposed to be part of South Asia and more kind of linked with policies to do with the Gulf and the Middle East. But today there is greater recognition that this growth and prosperity is spreading in Asia. Asia, which is home to 60% of the global population, is not just Japan, China, Korea. It is not even just Southeast Asia. It is also South Asia, where Bangladesh is notching up such good growth rates, where India, before the pandemic struck, was also doing well, and post-pandemic will also have definitely a spurt in its economic growth. And we have seen how growth has spread all the way to the east coast of Africa also. So in recognition of the new reality, which connects these two great oceanic spaces in the Indian Ocean, in the Pacific Ocean, and in the South China Sea, everybody is linked today. Economic growth is spreading. We are connected not just by trade, we are also connected by energy links, which go from the Gulf towards the East Asian countries where there are very large consumers like China, Korea, Japan. We also see how technology connects us today, how undersea cables connect us today, how the threat of piracy connects us today, whether piracy in the Gulf of Aden or whether piracy in the Southeast Asian waters in the Malacca. Piracy is a threat that connects us. 5G technology, this Internet of Things connects us today. Terrorism also connects us today. What is happening in the AFPAC areas, the kind of radicalization that takes place to the west of India is also connected to the kind of radicalization that you see today in southern Thailand or in Malaysia or in Indonesia, or even in terms of the war that the government of Philippines has to wage against radical Islamists in some of the islands like Mindanao, etc., in the Philippines. So the point here is that these two oceanic spaces, all the shipping within that, all the slocks, all the other links connect us today. We are connected also by other phenomena like climate change, where cooperation is required between all of us in this broad space to work together. We have to work together on critical technologies and supply chains as well. And so for that reason, the Indo-Pacific is a more modern, contemporary, and representative concept of the reality that we have today. The Asia-Pacific, which China prefers, gives primacy to China. And of course, it is understandable that China would prefer the continuing use of the Asia-Pacific. But it is not a representative concept. It is a concept that represents the changes that took place at the end of the Second World War, when after the Second World War, Japan rose from the ashes and it connected its economy to the American market across the Pacific. Thereafter, we have seen how Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, these countries and economies were able to do the same thing. And this phenomenon continued until the end of the last century. Asia Pacific. But as I told you, thereafter, in the last 20 years, growth has spread beyond that region to include South Asia, to include other parts of Asia. And so today, the Indo-Pacific is a more contemporary concept. But of course, it erodes the central importance of China. And China, of course, sees this as an attempt by the United States of America to encircle China, to restrict the rise of China. And so it, along with Russia, view this concept with a certain degree of suspicion. We, on our part, do not see the Indo-Pacific as an anti-China concept. The Prime Minister's vision is there for all to see in the remarks that he made to the Shangri-La dialogue in 2018, and subsequently his remarks at the East Asia Summit in Bangkok in 2019, where he spoke of the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. And these are cooperative and inclusive structures that we have been speaking. And we assume that it gives a certain amount of reassurance to a country like the Russian Federation, which is also a strategic partner for us. However, having said that, let me say that there is also something called the Quad. The Quad is one of many plurilateral, multilateral structures. Many countries engage bilaterally, trilaterally, and in a quadrilateral, plurilateral manner. The Chinese have their own many Quads with Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan, Russia, you name it. We also have our plurilateral dialogues, one of which is the quadrilateral security dialogue, which brings together like-minded countries such as the United States, India, Japan, and Australia. We have democracy in common. We are committed to the freedom of navigation and overflight. We are committed to an open and transparent, rules-based international order. And we are committed to working together on a number of issues. Now, many people say the Quad is an anti-China grouping. But the fact of the matter is that we are working on many things, such as infrastructure, capacity building, openness of the seas, navigation, overflight, unimpeded commerce, infrastructure building, and more recently, as you are aware, at the Quad summit of the heads of state and government in March this year, there has been agreement to also cooperate on themes such as, for instance, the pandemic vaccine, production to be ramped up very quickly among the four. Then things like critical technologies, which really takes us to important things like resilient supply chains as well, 5G, also things like climate change. And beyond that, naturally, there is also maritime security, HADR, and maritime cooperation as well. And we all four have the sovereign right to review what our security interests are, what are the major threats and challenges in the maritime space and the terrestrial space which threaten our long-term interests. And yes, it is possible that four countries would also share their views with one another regarding the rise of China and the unilateral attempts it makes to impose its military power on others, its naval power, its entry into spaces where it was absent in earlier decades and earlier centuries. The Indian Ocean being one such space where the Chinese presence is new and considered a great disruptor. The South China Sea is yet another space where they have created these artificial islands and tried to impose on all others the medieval concept of closed seas, what you call mare clausum concept, to the exclusion of all others. They have tried to, in the Pacific space, also go beyond the first island chain and break out of it in less than courteous manner, without their submarines, coming to the surface as they should under normal circumstances when traversing critical straits, especially when they are going through straits beyond Japan into the open Pacific waters. They have tried to subvert small Pacific island states, particularly in the South Pacific. They have tried to browbeat them to switch support from Taiwan to the Republic of China, and they've used every trick in the bag to put pressure on countries. And so therefore, yes, definitely within the Quad, there is not only a habit of cooperation on a number of issues, including maritime exercises, where each of these four countries are bringing platforms of increasing sophistication with each iteration of the exercise, known as the Malabar, for instance, which is the flip side of the Quad in terms of naval cooperation. But also, they would no doubt exchange views regarding the threats posed by China. The core, ultimately, of the Quad will be security oriented, but it will also have many developmental and other cooperative structures with which it can relate to others in a Quad plus format, which it is doing today with France, with Brazil, with Israel, with South Korea, with New Zealand and others. So that is something in which we see ourselves in the Quad. My own view of the Quad is that what the Quad will do in the future is hard to predict. Right now, it is not entirely an anti-China structure. It is a structure which brings four like-minded countries together into a habit of cooperation based on shared values. What it does in the future will also depend on Chinese behavior. Now, broadly at the other end of the spectrum in West Asia, we have seen how things are changing. Earlier, all of the world's oil and gas came out of West Asia, either from the Gulf or from some other countries in the region. Today, we have seen the emergence of the United States of America as one of the largest producers and exporter now of energy, of fossil-based energy, including clean energy as in natural gas. And countries like India, which depended almost entirely on Gulf oil and gas in the past, are now buying $10 billion or more worth of oil and particularly gas from the United States of America. So the salience and the importance of the Gulf with regard to the energy supplies from there has relatively gone down. Within the Gulf, intra-Gulf salience of certain countries has also gone down. Iraq is once again coming up as a major supplier. Iran's supplies went down because of the poor relations that Iran had with the United States, and the threat of US sanctions forced others to, including India, to look elsewhere. Saudi Arabia is today a big producer, but then the United States also produces as much as Saudi Arabia produces and exports nearly as much, if not more, than Saudi Arabia. So the importance of the Gulf is changing in a particular manner of analysis. It is also an area adjoining the restless AFPAC region, where there is terrorism, there is growing radicalization, there is the Shia-Sunni divide across the waters between Iran and Saudi Arabia. We have seen Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Daesh, etc., spreading its wings, not only through that region, but also all the way to the Horn of Africa and the east coast of Africa, in Kenya, in Tanzania, all the way to Mozambique. And we have also seen how Turkey has staged a kind of comeback in this region, bidding for supremacy, leadership position in the Islamic world to compete with the other two nodes that are there, which is Saudi Arabia and Iran. And with the changes that are taking place in Afghanistan, now that the United States have begun to extricate themselves from Afghanistan, they left Bagram Air Base, 3 days ago in the middle of the night, and handed over that entire vast facility, which houses 5,000 Taliban prisoners also, which has played such a key role in the pacification of terrorism and insurgency in Afghanistan. That was handed over to the Afghans. By the way, Kabul airport, for instance, is managed by Turkish security, private Turkish security providers. So Turkey has good relations, for instance, with Iran. Turkey has good relations with Afghanistan and Pakistan. Turkey fancies itself to be a great leader of the Islamic world. And it is a member of NATO. It is a member of the European Union. It has uneasy relations with the United States on certain aspects, it has had ups and downs with the Russian Federation, but it's a very important player. And I think the Turkish regime, is hell-bent on playing a bigger role in Afghanistan also, and will see itself increasingly playing an important role in the aftermath of the US exit. For us, we have to see how the US exit from Afghanistan affects us. A dialogue with all stakeholders in Afghanistan is important. We cannot take a myopic view and say we will talk only to X or Y. Flexibility is important in a dynamic situation. Indian diplomacy will also show the necessary flexibility. We have invested a lot in Afghanistan, something like $3 to $4 billion worth of investments there. We have been doing very well with regard to high impact, relatively low cost projects, about US dollars 1 million or so around the country. But we have also done some flagship projects like building the Afghan parliament, doing the Zarang Delaram Road, and Salma Dam, which is known as the Friendship Dam, the Khule Pumri, Phule Kumri power lines and power stations and whatnot. So we have, at the end of the day, great stakes in Afghanistan, and must see that on the one hand, we maintain dialogue with all stakeholders, remain embedded there in a developmental mode, protect our interests, at the same time harden our defenses on the borders, so that if there is any spillover of the negative impact of US and international departure from Afghanistan, that we prevent the Pakistani deep state from exploiting that against us by creating a surge in infiltration or bringing fighters in, once again creating basis for radicals along the AFPAC border, and then using them also to infiltrate Kashmir, etc. We have to be mindful of all this. Among the Gulf states also, relations have improved between Saudi Arabia and Qatar as a result of the Al-Ula agreement earlier this year. Among Israel and the West Asian Arabs, relations have improved recently through the Abraham Accords earlier this year, when Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, and the UAE also agreed to normalize relations with Israel. And it is to the credit of India that we have been able to maintain a very good balance, so to speak, between the Israelis and the Palestinians, including in Gaza and the West Bank. We have been able to maintain a balance between Iran and Saudi Arabia, a balance between the United States and Russia, and overall managed our interests quite well, such that we have very good cooperation even with some key OIC countries today, increasingly in information sharing, intelligence sharing, etc. And that can take the sting out of the OIC criticism that is sometimes heaped on India with regard to, for instance, the issue of Jammu and Kashmir. So we have not been wanting in this regard over the last few years, 6-7 years in particular. We have to acknowledge the fact that the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, and other leaders have visited countries which had not been visited by Indian leaders for 30 years. Even Nepal had not been visited for more than 2 decades. Imagine, next door, Nepal, not visited by the Prime Minister of India for 24 years. Naturally, that is a void in which the Chinese would step in, just as the Chinese stepped into the void created by a retreating United States in the South China Sea region, when the United States focused 2 decades ago on the war on terror by going into Afghanistan and then Iraq. They had taken their eye off the ball, so to speak, in Southeast Asia, in the Asia-Pacific space. And who stepped in immediately with a growing economy and growing military power and nobody to challenge it? It's the Chinese who stepped in. Now, if you do that in your neighborhood, you do it in the larger region, we cannot blame China then for taking advantage. And therefore, I think it is to the credit of the leadership in recent years that they reached out to countries, many of which had not been visited for 30 years, 40 years. You cannot expect them to support your case for candidate in the UN Security Council if you are not even on talking terms with them. You have never been there. When they bring out their leaders for bilateral dialogues, you are ready to send only a secretary level bureaucrat to talk to them. That has changed in recent years. We have engaged the world in a much more forthright manner. I think I've spoken at length. I'm wondering if at this stage I should stop having spoken for 44 minutes to allow you a chance to engage me. Let me end by saying that recently I would say that even Europe is changing. You see, many European countries had also begun to see the poorer European countries like Greece and Italy, and in Central Europe and in East Europe, many countries were looking at the Belt and Road with great hope and anticipation as being, their savior, because the West Europeans, the rich Europeans, had been tightening their purse strings and not helping as much. That is to say, Germany and France and some of these richer countries. That is how the Chinese acquired Piraeus port in Greece. That is how China engaged the Europeans in what they call the China plus 17 dialogue, making countries dependent even in Europe on the Chinese economy, allowing the Chinese to break up the consensus between the Europeans and the Americans, between the Europeans themselves with regard to the rise of China. But we have seen a backlash. A few years ago, India was one of the few countries, in fact, the only country pushing back against the Belt and Road as being a scheme that was not well thought out, not consultative, not feasible, not conducive to maintenance of and preservation of the environment, not based on the intrinsic sovereign needs and requirements and priorities of the recipient countries. But today, more than India, many other countries are saying the same thing. The United States has taken a more frontal and clear-cut position on the Belt and Road by coming up with its own new schemes like the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the International, what you call Development Finance Corporation, the Blue Dot Network, the ARIA, Asia Resilience Initiative Act, and so much is being done by them. Many others have started developing their own, Indo-Pacific visions. And we have seen how in Europe, in the group of 17 that was ready to engage till now, the Chinese, we have seen how Lithuania has just left that group. Others are also critical now. A country like Italy, that was open to the idea of working together with China on BRI, has recently joined the G7 statement. In England, condemning, in the UK, condemning China for its assertive economic, opaque, and non-transparent economic policies, etc. So there are certain winds of change that are now taking over the global community, and people are seeing the Chinese for what they are. That is an aggressive, assertive country. Of course, it's true to say that they have grown. They have removed, they have taken 600 to 800 million people out of absolute poverty. There are those achievements, but it has also come at a certain cost in terms of their reputation. The reputational cost for China is great. And there is no guarantee that they will continue to succeed in the distant future also, because they have followed today a policy which is different from what previous leaders had followed in China, which is hide your capacities and bide your time. Today, under Xi Jinping, they are aggressive. They are ready to take on the whole world. And it may also be premature. After all this decision-making and aggression is coming out of not just the party, but also one particular leader. And much will remain to be seen in terms of how the other decades, opening decades, the first half of the 21st century, pan out for the Chinese Communist Party, how long Mr. Xi Jinping will remain in power, even though he has lifted all limits to his remaining in power, as Mr. Putin has done in Russia. But after all, we are all human beings, and it's always finite in terms of those policies. So let's see how it pans out. I think I'll stop with that 48 minutes into my talk. And I'm told by Commodore Robert Thomas that this is 1 hour, 15 minutes. So we now have about 20 to 25 minutes for a Q&A. I hope I've tried to cover as much as possible to give you insights. I don't want to repeat things that are written about on a daily basis in newspaper articles and things. So I've simply spoken extempore to tell you something, what's coming to my mind on the theme of an emerging world order. And I hope this will set you thinking and exploring some of these themes yourself. Thank you.